Hi everyone, welcome back to Civil War Monitors Behind the Lines. I'm your host, David Thompson. Today, it's my pleasure to be joined by Dr. Susannah J. Ural, who is an Associate Professor of History at the University of Southern Mississippi, as well as a Senior Fellow in the Center for the Study of War and Society. And she is the recent author of Don't Hurry Me Down to Hades, The Civil War in the Words of Those Who Lived It, which is now out with Osprey Publishing. So, Dr. Ural, thanks so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
This is perhaps for individuals who are going to pick it up, not your typical Civil War story in the sense of how a historian might approach the topic. So I wonder if you could provide us with a little bit of a brief overview of what this book is really about, because you are really tackling an ambitious load here.
Well, we met with Osprey, I think it was probably about 2011, several of us in our Center for War and Society, which is actually the Dale Center now, it was just renamed. Andy Wiest was writing Boys of 67 for them, which follows a company through Vietnam. And they had told him they needed somebody to write a general history of the Civil War. And so Andy invited me to lunch with them, and that's kind of where it all started. Originally, it was supposed to be overwhelmingly based in just letters, just kind of from a certain collection. And then it became a broader experience. And what I really wanted to do and was able to sell them on this, and they were very supportive from the beginning, was, the last thing we need is another general history of the Civil War. Or at least I didn't feel like writing it. And what I've always been interested in is soldiers and families. Not only what happens to the men in camp and in the battlefield, but really what happens to them at home. And I also wanted to be able to tell that story while bringing general readers, because that's really who the book is targeted toward. Bring them up to date on some of the historiographical arguments without putting them to sleep with the historiographical arguments. Because, it's kind of we like the historiographical arguments, but it's a bit of a hard sell. So it's woven in there. And those were kind of the two big things I wanted. I wanted to, don't just focus on the battlefields. I mean, that's, military history is why I came to this field in the first place. But I think over the years I've also just developed an equal interest in the soldiers are always looking home. We look at them in camp, we look at them in the battlefield, we look at them when they're training, when they're fighting, but they're always looking home. And I think we make a mistake if we don't look where they're looking and incorporate that home front into the story too. So it was kind of that approach really shaped the way the book played out.
Now, obviously, dealing with such a broad topic in a sense of soldiers and families, we're not dealing with something like medical trauma, something that might lend itself to a slightly more specific group of source material. How did you tackle that, I guess, a good problem to have, there just being so much material out there? How did you decide what to incorporate, what might be cast aside, where you would actually look for material for this work?
Right. Some of it, I've been writing this book on the Texas Brigade, which will be done this year, if it kills me. I've been writing this longer than they fought the war, significantly longer. Some of it was some of my favorite stories, some of my favorite characters from that project that I wanted to get into the story, but a lot of it was really just based on what had worked well with students. I've been teaching at the college level for, since 1996, and so that's a lot of kind of test subjects, if you will, where you you weave this story into your lecture, and sometimes, you can just tell you have them. This is a great story. And there are other times where you think it's brilliant, and it's just crickets out there, and they're checking their phones. And so mainly it was what had worked in the past, not just with students, but we all go and talk to these Civil War roundtables, we go to talk to local groups, and it was really the best of that material. And then the other thing I wanted to check was, how many of these letters could I find that are generally online, so that if the average reader wanted to incorporate this, if it's a school teacher who's reading this and wants their students to be reading the actual letter, I made sure I put the link into the notes so that the teachers can really be able to use this. So some of it was stuff that people could also find readily available.
Now, you've mentioned soldiers and families, but I wonder, what other types of themes do you kind of find as you were assembling this, you were kind of wove through this work, and that you hope people might be able to pick up on?
I think the one thing that most people have mentioned that has struck them, and I don't know if it's also because, as we work our way through the sesquicentennial events, here we are at the 1864 anniversaries, and we're all kind of picking up on this, is the exhaustion that you see on both sides and the continued determination, but how it changes by the time you get to 63, 64. Whereas, 61, I incorporated some individuals into the story who they're not, rosy-eyed optimistics. They have a funny feeling of what's coming, and they choose to go forward determined, but, they're by no means naive. But by 63, 64, no one's really naive about what this war is going to cost, and so they're really reflecting on this. And so, you can get Tally Simpson's letters where he's, sitting down on Christmas Eve, writing to his family, and he was one of the kind of bright-eyed optimistics, and just kind of, God, how much longer is this going to take? As he writes on Christmas of 62, and of course he's going to die at Chickamauga. And so it's interesting to see kind of the young reflecting on this. And I think the other thing that's really stood out is that the overwhelming exhaustion, yet at the same time, what are you going to do? Quit? You can't. If you quit, you have to give it all up. Your side will lose. And you see this with Southerners, but you see it with Northerners too. And so what I was able to do was find these couples who are arguing over this, or sons who are writing home trying to explain things to fathers or mothers, and to really capture that kind of exhaustion and also that kind of determination that you really see on both sides.
Now, I wonder if you'd be willing to perhaps share a few of your favorite characters from this. I know you mentioned that some of them are individuals that you have encountered with your current project or perhaps previously in class, but are there some highlights that you found that you just, these are the folks that really just encapture the war itself, or you just find their stories enamoring?
Well, I think the Lockridges from Texas, they're living near Corsicana, Texas, so that's kind of East Texas between Houston and Dallas. And I found this letter collection. It was actually a student of mine who was transcribing it, who made me aware of it. And I've never seen such a rich collection of not only the soldiers' letters home, he's an officer in the 4th Texas, but also a number of the wife's letters to her husband were preserved. And you also have them writing to, or the mother writing on behalf of, their 4- and 1-year-old daughters. And so what you get is this kind of, how do parents explain war and a father's absence for a long period of time, and Santa Claus is off helping Daddy fight the Yankees, kind of stuff, that you just can't make this stuff up. Ulysses S. Grant is always interesting material. I mean, you just don't get tired of him. He's just so reflective. I'd probably also say, if we want to deal with kind of the better known figures, Verena Davis, her mind, I think, is just one of those things that just always fascinates me. And just, here's a woman who from the very beginning said this isn't going to work, but we're moving forward, and she knew she was going to have to move forward too, and so off you go. And so, you watch her in that kind of old Whig Southern wrestling with what they're trying to do, what they're trying to preserve. And so Verena Davis is fun for that. There are a couple others. William Shepard was a Union soldier who a friend of mine, Kurt Hackemer, edited his Civil War letters and published them with Tennessee Press. And Shepard is a wonderful example of very well-educated, very thoughtful, reflective volunteer who writes letter after letter, and who pretty much, from what we can tell, probably suffered some sort of traumatic breakdown after the Battle of Shiloh. And when it's his chance to kind of re-up in the spring of 1864, absolutely chooses not to. He's not going to do it. I'm done. I'm out. So that's good. And probably the last one of my favorites is actually thanks to Steve Barry, who, in Civil War Monitor, wrote a piece about the Lincoln assassination, but really wrote it kind of talking about Claire Harris and Henry Rathbone and what happens to them as they experienced it and after the war. And so what I really tried to do, really throughout the book, was tell famous stories, but from somebody else's perspective. So instead of hearing it from Jefferson Davis, let's hear it from Verena Davis. Instead of hearing about the Lincoln assassination from Lincoln's perspective or from Booth's perspective, let's hear about it from Mary Surratt's perspective or Claire Harris and Henry Rathbone's perspective. Let's hear it from Fanny Seward's. What did she see, as her father is being attacked, that kind of thing.
Now, question just kind of came to mind as you're speaking there, so I hope I'm not putting you too much on the spot here, but I wonder, as a military historian, you're looking at some of the scholarship that's coming out during the course of Sesquicentennial, and I wonder, people who are trying to marry somewhat military history and social history, do you have a sense of where you think these disciplines are going kind of in the future? Is it just going to be an absolute fusion? Do you think we're going to try and have two stark fields, or do you see something completely different from that?
Oh, Lord. I'm going to wave off making any kind of predictions, and I'll tell you what I hope.
Okay.
I'm very involved in building bridges, particularly between the Society of Civil War Historians and the Society for Military History. Because, I firmly believe that you take the best from every field and you make your own field better. And I think, this is hardly an original thought. I thought you can coin it for me, but, I'm hardly the only one who's ever said this. And so to me, if we're going to move forward and we'll move forward well, and if we'll move forward strongly, it will be to blend the best of all sorts of fields into Civil War history and military history. That does not mean that, I'll never support attacks on traditional military history or operational history. I think it has a place. I think it has a very strong place. On the other hand, I also think that there is a wealth of work to be done if we incorporate some of the new approaches to memory that, you're seeing with, Ann Rubin's doing it, with Sherman March, Leslie Gordon's doing it. Kerry Janey's new book, looking at, the so-called reconciliation. There's wonderful work being done where you're taking from multiple fields. And to me, as long as we keep doing that, we're doing a good job as historians. So, take the best.
Fair enough. Has there been a Civil War book recently that you've really, to you, it's just stuck out? It's something that you'd highly recommend to folks, or perhaps a couple if you don't want to be wedded just to one? I realize that's tough.
Oh my gosh, one. I can't. Yeah, I definitely can't do one. I'm trying to think of. I'll tell you one that was really helpful when I was writing Hades was Stephanie McCurry's Confederate Reckoning, which when it first came out, I honestly looked at it and was like, eh? I really like her work, and I was just, there's no there. But as you read it, it has this wonderful approach of showing how, these Southern women weren't losing the will to fight. They were arguing a very, almost 18th century American argument about the rights of citizenship and social contracts, and that a deal had been struck, and that the local and the state and the federal governments were going to have to abide by that deal, by that arrangement. Yeah, and so it's one of those books that it took a little while to grow on me, if you will. But as it did, it became one of those kind of favorite resources that really helped. As I was doing my own work. If you want my favorite Civil War novel, I can give you that.
Absolutely.
John W. Thomason Jr.'s Lone Star Preacher. Okay. Hands down, best, no argument, just walk away. That's the best one. It sacrifices the Moonlight Magnolias and has a certain element of, by no means is it unclear which side Thomason's rooting for, but a much more honest look, I think, at veterans, at what soldiers went through during the war, and that kind of thing.
Fair enough. Well, I'll ask you just one more question, then I'll let you go, not take up too much of your time. In the classroom, talking about the Civil War, are there any, and I'm sure you were thinking about this as you approach writing this book, but are there specific ideas that you try to impart upon your students about the war that you hope that if they had to, write down, what's the one big takeaway from this course, for instance, by the end of it, that it's something that you would hope that, more than one of them might pick up on? Is there kind of a dominant trope or approach that you really like to stress?
There's probably two. The one is, and it seems so obvious, but always reminding the undergrads in particular that Civil War Americans don't know how this is going to play out. We know how it's playing out. We know what each action is leading toward, but that generation doesn't. It's all in the balance, and to keep that in mind as you're trying to understand why they do what they do. And probably the other thing is to get them to stop trying to put white hats and black hats on characters of the past, and let it be messy, and to learn to enjoy the messiness of it. I think probably my favorite way of just completely getting them just, uncomfortable and then helping them kind of come around to interpret the sources is, actually it's in Steve Berry's Weird in the War. Amy Muriel Taylor wrote that piece about Joseph Miller, the Union soldier, who's in the contraband camp and his family is cast out and then his family dies, and how Northerners interpret this. And it's such a puzzling, heart-wrenching story. Not only what happens to Miller, but how it's interpreted by these Northern abolitionists. And it's that wonderful opportunity to just, try and judge people by 21st century standards. Take them for who they are and just understand why they're doing what they're doing and try and not excuse it or defend it, but just to make sense out of it.
Well, Dr. Ural, thank you so much for taking a little bit of time out of your day. Again, the book is Don't Hurry Me Down to Hades, The Civil War in the Words of Those Who Lived It, with Osprey Publishing, now out. It's a really great work, and I mean that in all sincerity, and I hope people pick up a copy because it is giving you a very much not your traditional kind of take on the war, but is really offering some very intriguing and interesting characters and kind of how they are dealing and trying to grapple with the hardships that are associated with this war, and that it did not occur in a vacuum, and you are exceptional in how you relay that. So thank you so much for taking some time out of your day, and perhaps we can have you on to talk about the Texas Brigade once that venture has concluded.
Absolutely. Thank you.